which leads me to say that if you are questioning if you're an imposter, that's a really good sign. It means most likely you're not. You're just really caring about the work you're doing and you're aware.
Hello and welcome to Real Men Feel. This is your host, author, coach, and healer, Andy Grant. Visit theandygrant.com to learn more about me. We have conversations that most men are not having, but that all men and the women who love them can benefit from. My guest today is Kendra Dahlstrom. Kendra is an executive coach, keynote speaker, and host of the Unworthy Leader Podcast. She helps high-achieving leaders ditch zero-sum leadership and embody authentic authority, because success is not based solely on performance. She shares that imperfection is the new normal, the importance of humility, and the fact that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a strategy. Looks like I picked the right shirt to wear today. Let's do it. Hello, Kendra, and welcome to Real Men Feel.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I've been looking forward to this conversation and spending time with you.
Oh, me too. So let's just jump right in. Can you share a moment when imposter syndrome hit you hard, and what did it teach you?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two parts. I think I've had several moments in my life when it's hit me. One when I was younger, and I didn't know that that's what it was. I just knew the feelings, I knew the sensations, I knew how it impacted my body and my mindset. So I'll share one when I was a little older, like when I actually thought, oh, is that what I'm experiencing? And I was actually in the workplace. I was in my 20s, and I was always a high achiever, and that's part of my story is just high achievements and always looking for external validation through success and achievements coming from a trauma-informed life. And as part of that process, I started to notice a cognitive dissonance with the effort and the value that I thought I was providing, Andy, and what I felt was being received, right, from management, middle management, higher management on the other side. And I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. I know my ideas are good. I know I'm not arrogant. But at the same time, I feel like there's this real mismatch. And so immediately, because of my trauma-informed childhood, I thought, oh, I must be doing something wrong. I must change something about me in order for them to better understand what it is I'm trying to communicate. Instead of it maybe just being, maybe they're not interested, maybe it didn't land, all the other options. But because of my background, it was really the first moment where I felt like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe my ideas aren't as good as I think they are. Maybe I'm not fit for this job. And so I started doing the thing that most people do. And I started looking for a new job. And then I noticed that pattern, about every 2 years kind of repeating itself for a while until I got into my early 30s. And then that's when I really started getting deeper into this work and realizing that wasn't solving the problem. It was just moving the deck chairs around the deck, So that is sort of when I first experienced it. The second answer I want to give you is that pop culture has named it imposter syndrome, which I think really makes it much more complex and complicated for us to move through and work with, because a syndrome is something essentially that, right, we have for the rest of our life. It's not curable. It's an endemic of sorts. And the reality is that it's not. It's something we can choose to listen to. We can choose to believe. We can question its validity and learn and grow from that through gratitude. And so I know we're going to get deeper into that, but I did just want to address that at the beginning of the episode, is that I like to reframe it as imposter thoughts. So it gives us more agency versus imposter syndrome. And it's no fault by you or any of the listeners for referring to it as that, because that's what pop culture is taught of.
And that's a great differentiation. I really appreciate that, because they are just our thoughts. Like I was realizing earlier in preparing for this that I've often considered myself as a fraud and felt that those imposter thoughts, but I've never watched someone else and decided they're being an imposter. Mm-hmm. So is this something that's just normally a label we put on ourselves as opposed to others?
Yes, and so for those of us that are emotionally intelligent and consciously aware, the answer is yes. We don't usually ever think anybody is, even if it's, let's say, a new CEO that's like first-time CEO and you're at the company, you most likely allow them grace, right, Andy? You would say, oh, wow, they're really good and they bring this expertise, but it's going to take them a while to get used to this job. It's a new job. They're learning, they're growing. We find competence in their ability to grow and be resilient. We're not finding competence in everything they know. And that's the disconnect, is when we're holding ourselves accountable and we think we're an imposter, we're holding ourselves accountable for what we need to know or what we think we need to know, not our ability to be resilient and to grow and adapt. So we give other people much more grace than we give ourselves. So that's the first part. The second part is around this unique thing that if somebody is truly an imposter, like think through movie Catch Me If You Can, right? With Leonardo DiCaprio, about that real story about the guy. He was clearly an imposter and pretending to be a doctor and all these things. They actually never question if they are. They don't have that social aptitude or emotional intelligence, at least through my own research. Again, I'm not a psychologist or psychotherapist. However, in my own research and my own lived experience, I found that those people never question if they're an imposter, which leads me to say that if you are questioning if you're an imposter, that's a really good sign. It means most likely you're not. You're just really caring about the work you're doing and you're aware.
So I know you've worked with multiple Fortune 10 companies. How common is it for you to find business leaders that have these thoughts about being a fraud?
It's fairly common. I would say over 90%, even though many would not admit it. So again, like the work you do, Andy, we often will see signs and symptoms, but we have to meet the client where they're at. So we won't call it out unless we feel like they're really ready to hear that. The interesting part about this is it's highly contextual. So a great example is that I can work with a very high functioning C-suite leader, engineer, or sales or marketing expert who knows their domain very well. As soon as they move to a new domain and or activity, like keynote speaking, suddenly it's a change in dynamic. So suddenly they realize, oh my gosh, I thought that because I'm so competent over here, I would be equally competent over here. And so they're holding themselves to a really high standard. And what they realize is that it doesn't always transfer. It's not as smooth. There's going to, and especially if it's outside of their comfort zone to speak on stages to tens of thousands of people, there's a learning curve there. And so oftentimes I'll deal with leaders that are very confident in their day job, but they start to get some imposter thoughts and a lot of self-doubt, nerves when it comes to speaking on stage. But if you put them back in the container that they're familiar with, they're fine.
So it's in the first example, this isn't something that only newbies face, but any new task, any new goal, any new project, any new action can bring this up, even if you've been experiencing something else for, and very successful at it.
Absolutely. And I mean, case in point, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, and I'll share my stories. When you first started a podcast, even though you're a very outgoing, easy person to talk to, did you ever have moments where you thought like, well, gosh, maybe I'm not ready, or what am I doing?
Oh, sure. I wouldn't have described myself as easy to talk to and outgoing. So yeah. I mean, yeah, my astrological sign is a Cancer. I'm like, yeah, I'm withdrawn. I'm shocked at how good I've become at engaging people in conversation, but that skill wasn't there on episode 1.
Right. So you had to learn and grow it. And so same for me, even though I would be considered a social extrovert and I've done keynote speaking and I'm comfortable facilitating workshops and trainings and whatnot. At the same time, this is a whole new thing, right? A whole new task or project. So as soon as I started doing this, I just stayed in the joy of it and that was fine. But then as soon as I stepped out of the joy and started looking at it like a business and all the tasks and all the things that have to be done on the back end, I immediately was like, oh gosh, maybe I'm not good enough to be doing this. So it's very normal. And so that's one goal of the Unworthy Leader podcast, is to just help normalize these conversations and feelings, because we have them several times a day, all of us in different contexts. And the more that we can actually start creating community on shows like yours and talking about the things that you talk about, vulnerability and all these types of things, and embrace those as actual leadership qualities, the more that I believe we have a chance to actually not just change the culture we're in, Andy, but corporate culture, the corporate culture that's like, oh no, that's a weakness. And I have to pretend like I know all the answers and I'm not scared.
So you mentioned dealing with clients that have the symptoms of imposter thoughts, but they struggle to admit it. So why do you think so many high achievers, especially men, are kind of the last people to open up and recognize that this is an issue for them?
Yeah, such a good question. I've been thinking about it a lot before we met, given your discreet audience. And so I think one thing is gender neutral, but that men and women both experience for women who are also listening, is that we often get wrapped up with our identity in what we do, not who we are. And so that gets really intertwined with our career, because we spend so much of our time in work, in our career, in our title, in our job. And we, even if we think we're doing a good job of keeping it mutually exclusive from who we are and our own innate and intrinsic value, it's really hard. And so I feel like because of how things have evolved, if you think back to the beginning of time when men were, doing a lot of the protecting, and depending on the tribe, they were the ones doing the hunting, although I know that can vary. But the point is that they were sort of the ones out there doing the work, and the women were, doing the more nurturing activities, right? And the food and with the children and whatnot. And so as we think about how that's evolved into where we are today, I think it's harder for men. It's hard for women too, but I think it's a lot harder for men, it's my observation, to decouple what they do from who they are, which is why I think the work you're doing is so important, Andy. And then the next layer to that I'll just add here is that many people don't often realize that success and shame can coexist. I think many times we think like, oh, if I am successful, then I cannot show that I am still healing or, dealing with shame from trauma-informed life or whatever it may be. And so what that leads to, as you would know of anyone else, is the stuffing down of the shame, and then the filling of the success bucket to feel better about ourselves, to contradict that shame.
Right. Yeah. We can't, at least I can't. I have not been successful at being so successful that I can bury my shame, or I can love something enough that if I don't love myself, I somehow am balancing that out. And yeah, I find that's just not a possibility.
Yeah. And so I mean, I would love to hear from men who are listening to this and your listeners on, if my observations are true, but that's when I run into leaders who are male that are very high functioning. They often have these symptoms of shame beneath the surface, but they're not ready to acknowledge it or admit it, because again, you have to think about how we branded the workplace. We don't deal with emotions. We don't deal with feelings. We stick with facts. And so what that does is it just creates emotional bypassing, which is further stuffing.
How does someone tell the difference between healthy self-awareness and, sabotaging self-doubt?
That's a great question. So I'll just answer how I've done it, and then I'd love to hear what works for you, because I think between the two of us, your listeners, probably could answer it. And the reason I hesitate to give a prescription is because, again, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, so I want to be real thoughtful about the listeners here and what they glean from it. But for me, I realized that peace is the end all be all for me. So when I'm making a decision or when I'm evaluating something, I always ask myself, does this bring me closer to peace or further away from peace? And the one clarity on that is that it doesn't always mean that it's something that feels good, but you just know in your heart and soul that it's going to bring you closer to peace. Like, oh, this is something I have to go through. This is something I need to learn, but I know lifting this weight is going to get me to the goal that I want of having these really nice biceps. It doesn't always feel good while you're going through, right? So I found that question is my lighthouse, so to speak, in terms of really helping me evaluate as I'm looking at data, for instance, and say, oh my gosh, I am sabotaging myself. I don't think I'm going to do good at this speech or workshop or keynote. I have to stop and say, are these thoughts bringing me closer to peace or further away? Well, the answer for me is further away. Now, is there truth in something I could do different? Yeah, I think you need to block 2 more hours of rehearsal on your calendar, and you need to go through the outline about 2 times to make sure it's really tight and articulating the message that you want them to walk away with. And do those things bring me closer to peace? Yes. Are they maybe going to be task-driven and take some time and mental power? Yes. Is that helpful?
Yeah. No, I agree. And in my experience, I find that the stricter a negative thought is, that's the sabotaging self-doubt.
Hmm.
Whereas if it's gentlest, oh, I need, like you're saying, I need to practice it a little more. If those more subtle things are the healthy awareness.
Yes, yes, I absolutely think so. And where I think it gets conflated is that oftentimes there could be a glimmer of truth in the stricter thought, but when we think through, how God and light operates, it's gentle, right? It doesn't come at you like that. That's dark energy, right? Or Satan or whatever you want to call it, right? So that's dark energy. And so we need to be careful which energy we're attaching our truth to.
Yeah, cool. Kendra, I've heard you say that the real impact of a leader is based on humility.
Hmm.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think we're all tired of smoke and mirrors. Culturally, I think we're at a paradigm shift. Not just what's going on globally, but if we just look at leaders and even look at companies and monopolies and things going on around the world, at a corporate scale as well as global and government scale, I think we're really wanting humility. We don't expect someone to be perfect, but we just want to know that we're getting truth. And I think post-pandemic, I think just because all of things that transpired, I think people are just, doubtful. And now, unfortunately, we're living in this world that's very divided. Like, oh, you're here or here. And you and I both understand the power of oneness. And so that makes it hard, right? It's like, oh, okay, we just have to start being the light and being positive and all those things. So I think as we look through the next generations of leaders, I think humility and authenticity, Andy, are something that have been a requirement for a long time. Like even if you think back to tribal people and population, indigenous cultures and how they operate, and we lost it along the way as we scaled into quote unquote corporate business and what we expect of people. Even if you look at politicians, like what we expect of them, like no one's ever going to be perfect. Like that's really ridiculous that we ever thought someone was going to be perfect, in order to be in X position. And so I think we're hopefully dialing more towards an era where humility and authenticity and the willingness to be vulnerable and share truth, accept mistakes, not be ego driven is going to be even more important. And then layered on top of it, we have Gen AI. So what is going to differentiate leaders from what Gen AI can do, which is just, tasks. Here's how I'm going to delegate. Here's the ideas. Here's the strategic plan. I mean, at some point, Gen AI, it's already pretty close to being able to do that. But what will differentiate a good leader is their EQ, right? Is their ability to lean in and say, oh, Andy, great job on the work, but how are you feeling? What can I do to help support you in your career growth? Those kinds of conversations that many leaders are still not having.
Is emotional intelligence something that is an innate skill or isn't, or is it something that's learnable for everybody?
So there's different schools of thought on it. I'm of the school of thought that it is something that's learnable. I believe we're all born with it. It's innate. It's just how much you were trained and programmed to turn it off as a child, right? I mean, if you look at a baby, they're very emotionally intelligent. They're very aware of their thoughts and feelings, and then they take action based on that and what they want to do. Now, one would say that if you look at the composites of EQ, that their impulse control is probably very low because they think something, feel it, and then they do it right away. But those things come with lived experience. So the one thing I really like about the psychometric assessment for EQ that is untrue of any other psychometric assessment is that you can actually work on a composite or a certain quality like empathy or impulse control or stress tolerance, and you can actually see it move. You can actually change your test results. Whereas a lot of the other psychometric assessments are behavior based and they'll say, oh, Andy, you're an ENTJ and you're always going to be. And so I think that is very empowering for leaders and people to be able to understand that it's a snapshot in time. That's the result. And that this is a skill that if I choose to lean into and grow, I can.
So, Kendra, you mentioned your podcast earlier, The Unworthy Leader. What inspired you to create that? And how do people react to unworthy being in the title?
So unworthiness has been my story for a long time. I think it's something, again, from, trauma informed background all through childhood and then just further patterned and reinforced through 20s and somewhat into my 30s. And then it got better, but then it would show up in pockets. And I just got better at hiding it, even though I was really successful in my day job inside. I still just felt like I was in a lot of angst. And so fast forward till, I don't know, last summer, I'd already had this idea of doing a podcast, and I had kind of played around with the name and had been advised against it because most podcasts, you want to name the positive, right? If you think of duality, you don't want to name it the thing people don't want to be. You want to name it the thing that you know that they are because they're whole and complete, or the thing they aspire to be. And so I had branding experts and marketing experts say, oh, I don't know that you should do that. You should call it the confident leader or something else. But, to the point of knowing our truth, I meditated on it. I sat with it for a long time. I journaled and I said, no, this is the title. This is the title. About a month later, I ended up getting really sick, ended up with streptococcus pneumonia, turned to septic shock. It was in respiratory failure, the beginning of liver and heart failure, and was really sick, obviously, almost died, had this sort of NDE type experience in the hospital. And 3 or 4 days later, come out, and it was that experience where I realized two things. One was that I was so stubborn that I had to test how worthy I am to be here and try to leave. And God said, no, you're here. And I thought, wow, I can't believe I've been so stubborn through my whole life that I had to go through something that crazy to actually now believe I'm worthy of being here and that I have a purpose. I'm not here by chance. I'm here on purpose. And so I said, I absolutely have to launch this podcast because I want to share this message and I want to normalize this because I feel like so many people can relate to this on different levels, whether it's past or present or contextual or omnipresent, whatever it is. And so I felt like that whole experience, the purpose of it was to call me to do this. And people have written me back that I've asked to be on the show, and they say, well, tell me what you mean by the unworthy leader, because I think they're nervous about identifying their brand with it. And I get that. And so I acknowledged that. And I said, yeah, this isn't for you. That's fine. However, I will tell you that the people that have come on have been the people who are more open and willing to say, you know what? Yeah, I felt these things. And those are the exact guests I want. I don't really want someone who's going to come on and share platitudes of, yeah, I felt doubt, but not really be willing to share the whole truth. That's what I'm trying to get away from.
Yeah, and in case people aren't familiar with NDE, that's near-death experience.
Oh, thank you.
And
Yeah.
you seeing how that, you put yourself through that to prove your worthiness very much aligns with my history of suicide attempts. And I keep after, let's just check one more time. Let me try to get out of here, make sure I'm supposed to be here. And, that's, did you need to test your worthiness just the one time?
Well, I had contemplated suicide when I was younger, on 2 different occasions. Nothing as significant as yours, thank goodness, where I actually, went through with the act or whatnot. The first one, I was about 10 years old, and I was going through a significant time with bullying, but it was also a time when my dad was threatening for full custody, and there was a lot of abuse going on in that household and things. So it was just really rough for me. And I think I just felt completely alienated by some of the social, I guess people call them norms, but the not very compassionate tactics going on in the cliques. And so I remember, holding a knife to my wrist in the kitchen, and I was putting some pressure. And it was starting to get red, but it wasn't bloody. And then my mom walked out of her room. Obviously, I hadn't thought through this very well, and thank goodness. And I pulled it away. And then, and then I think, if I think back on that moment, I think it was just sort of this larger knowing and voice came in that said, don't do that. Just don't do that. So I feel very grateful that, I felt like it was divine intervention on both instances. The later one was when I was undergoing a sexual harassment lawsuit, which was just awful and rough. And I had happened to also go through ACL surgery that was not recovering well. And now what I know about somatics and everything else, I said, well, my right knee, I mean, all this, like, this makes total sense, right? The masculine side, everything, knees are about movement and going forward in life and everything. And so I was also on the medication they give you, and I don't think I was reacting very well to it, but I didn't know that. And so I was just like, I'm going to take this bottle. And luckily at that time, a friend called me and knew something was wrong. And luckily I was honest and I said, okay, you need to come pick up this bottle. And so they came and got it. So nothing, as extreme as what you've been through, Andy, but I think there were two other times where I felt like I tested it. And when I look back in hindsight, God wanted to keep me here for some reason. Now I know why.
Yeah, I just want to throw something there. And suicidal thoughts, attempts, it's not a competition.
Right.
I don't want to be considered, oh, I'm better at that than anyone. Like, that is not the thing. So
Yeah.
having the thought once in your life can be a horrible, horrible experience. I'm glad you saw the truth and listened to those voices and saw your worthiness, because this goes back to kind of the discussion about thoughts of fraud.
Hmm.
I find that only the worthiest people question their worth.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's right. Because we have such high, I would say consciousness, social awareness, a need to help, a need to actually have purpose. And it means a lot to us that we're actually self-actualized in that.
Yeah.
And if we're not, we feel like a fraud, right?
So I'm going to change the tone a little bit. I recently came across a 20-year-old journal, and it was from the first time I worked with a coach. And he had me describe and draw a picture of my gremlin, of my darkest voice. And it looked like Danny DeVito as the penguin. So that made me think about this. So if imposter syndrome had a voice, what would it sound like?
Well, I'll say this. It doesn't know compassion. It doesn't know love. It doesn't have your highest good or interest at heart. And it doesn't hold grace. And so I can tell you what it doesn't have. Now, in terms of what it does have, it's usually always it's very critical. It always assumes the worst possible scenario, and it's judgment. If I was to put it into one word, it's pure judgment from a place of mockery, belittlement, and disempowerment. Now, what the voice actually sounds like depends on each individual. Some people, when you really do the work, it's like, oh, that's my mother, that's my father, that's my grandmother, that's my stepmother, that's that teacher I had in second grade, that's my best friend that I had in high school. So it can vary on terms of like sound, but in terms of its vibration and tone and energetic blueprint, I'll call it, it's never of and for the highest good of you. It's
Right.
I always like to call it's like the wedge of Satan. It's the wedge of darkness that finds a little spot to get in there, and then that's when it starts to do its work.
Does anything stand out for you as a ridiculous thing you told yourself in the past that now you can laugh at?
Oh, geez, there's so many. I mean, one that may not seem relative, but it comes up actually quite a bit is I always loved animals. And I had always thought about being a vet, but because I didn't always have the healthiest mindset, I never thought I was going to be smart enough to get into vet school. So I didn't even try. So here I am, about 25, I'm in high tech working. And I was at this point in my life where I was kind of starting to question, like, am I doing what I love? And, what's going on? And so I thought about going back to vet school. And so I got my diploma from my Bachelor of Science from where I went to college. I got all the paperwork ready and I was starting to apply. And then I heard this voice in my head say, Kendra, you're so dumb. Why would you want to try to go back to school now? You're 25. You wouldn't even be out of school and be able to become a vet until you're probably almost 30. By then, you're going to be so old. Like, what are you even thinking? And I laugh at that now because now I understand, here I am 50 and I'm like, that was a blip in time, but here was this voice trying to sabotage and convince me that I was not adequate to go after this dream of caring for animals.
Kendra, is there a practice or a program or a book that has really helped you that you would like to share?
Oh my gosh, there's so many, Andy, and I think like many of us, we kind of find a hybrid that like a little bit of everything that works for us. The one thing that I think has worked the most for me is somatic, is being able to really pause and quiet and start to feel into like your body and what is going on. It's not just the thought, but the thought is usually connected to something in your body. And even if it is only up here, starting to get curious and ask it questions about, okay, what color are you? And if you were to have it be a shape, what shape are you? And what does the red fur ball want to tell me? Because when you start to dissociate it like that, it becomes easier to not only hear what's going on, but not be as emotionally impacted by it. And I found so many raw truths and just impeccable wisdom come to me through those conversations. And relief has been on the other side of it. So I would say from like a trauma informed imposter thought model, that would really be what I would say would help me the most. But obviously there's meditation, there's journaling. A lot of times you could like, even like you can do inner child journaling with the adult, self. You can do the same with the imposter, right? So your right hand is your higher self and your God born, self. And then your left hand would be, okay, these imposter thoughts. And then you allow them to have an exchange. And sometimes what you'll find is that imposter thought is just a defiant child that wants attention. So they're kicking the chair, they're throwing the food, and they're angry because of whatever they've experienced as a child. And I'll offer that it's rightly so. They're angry. And because we're taught to suppress all these things and not give it attention, then the older we get, we start to say, oh, I feel silly thinking about when I was 4. Like, why can't I just get over that? But if you really give it space and time to do it, and the journaling is a great way to do it, you start to realize that the imposter thought is often just, this 4-year-old kid that just wants a little attention. So it's throwing ice cream across the room. So,
What is one thing that you wish more men knew?
well, I think I started by saying that the worth isn't always tied to productivity, performance, and the pressure to hold it all together. And that your value isn't what you do, although we can talk about self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy. That's a different conversation, but it's more about who you are, like as a human being, who you are. And I think a lot of, like I said, men find themselves defining who they are by what they do. And that's an easy thing to do, especially because we want to be the change we want to see. And so when you start getting those kinds of idioms and whatnot, it makes it really complex. But I would say that that's number one. And then the next thing is that vulnerability is not a weakness, it's a strategy. It's not to be overused, right? It's supposed to be used with deliberateness and precision, and it's not to be manipulated. But when used appropriately within context, it has so much power to open up relationships and conversations in a room. And if you're really after influence and leadership and building deep relationships, whether it be with your team or family, that's where it starts, because that's when like safety kicks in. And then actually people are open to sharing thoughts and ideas. And that's how we become a better people, a better culture. And that's where innovation lies in the technology realm.
Kendra, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Well, they can certainly find me on my website, which is kendradahlstrom.com. There's a contact button there with a variety of ways to contact me, whether or not if you want to talk about me facilitating a workshop, you want one-on-one coaching, you want team coaching, you want a keynote, it's all there. You can also find me on Spotify. You can listen to our podcast there, and it's also published on YouTube under the Unworthy Leader Podcast. And I also have presence on Instagram and LinkedIn. But I would say the main ways to get a hold of me are probably my website with the contact button or LinkedIn.
Awesome. Kendra, I'm so glad. So I was recently a guest on your podcast.
Mhm.
I'm glad we connected and have been continuing this conversation on both of our platforms because, as you said, it's a very needed one, and it's a worthy discussion to
Yeah.
talk about worthiness, right?
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, and your shirt says it all, right? And I know you're the king of vulnerability. So I love that we were able to connect on this because I think the world needs more people like you that are willing to stand up and say that, vulnerability and masculinity don't have to be mutually exclusive. This is something we're just telling ourselves, and it's not helping us as a people or as individuals.
Yeah, that's why I love, you're saying vulnerability is not a weakness, but a strategy. And I
Yeah.
often say that vulnerability and authenticity are superpowers that too many men ignore and have been taught otherwise. So
Yeah.
yeah, keep making a lot of noise
Yeah. Thank
and
you.
shaking that tree of unworthiness and see who drops out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think between the two of us, we can change the culture to move away from zero-sum thinking. Like I have to be a leader, but it has to be across or myself and my humanness, which is vulnerability, which is authentic.
Super.
Thank you
Thanks
so
again,
much.
Kendra. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Please visit realmenfeel.org and see the blog post for this episode. We'll have all the various links and resources discussed. Wherever you're discovering Real Men Feel, please subscribe, follow, like, share this episode with someone, post a review or a comment. If you don't know where you want to go, it is impossible to get there. If that's the case for you, I invite you to book a free clarity call with me. Visit theandygrant.com/talk. We'll explore what you want, what's in your way, and what you can do about it. Until next time, be good to yourself.